Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Dr. Eric Helms, back again. We have more to discuss from our last interview. If everybody wants to go listen, it's not too far. Got to scroll a little bit. I can't remember the number, but it's good to see you again, my friend.
Oh, thank you for having me back, dude. Much appreciated.
All right, let's go right into it. This will be a quick question, but this is going to be a broad, overarching conversation that'll tie it all together. How close to failure do you need to train? And I should separate strength and muscle development because there is a difference.
Yeah, so you're great at quick questions. I'm great at long answers. So match made in probably not heaven. But no, I'm glad you separated the two. And I think the term need is really where you get people caught up on this. So, the classic debate between kind of the HIIT crowd or the higher volume crowd, that operates differently when you're in the bodybuilding space versus the general population space. And that has been gone all the way back, if you look at the history, till literally Arthur Jones in the Nautilus era, where you had this weird mixture of a segment of the bodybuilding community, most notably led by Mike Menser and then carried on by folks like Dorian Yates, discussing how it was absolutely critical and only the last few reps really mattered for bodybuilding. But Arthur Jones leveraged that a bit, but his primary focus was on trying to not only emphasize HIIT, but also the Nautilus machines to say, hey, people don't have the time. So you come in, you do a circuit, you don't have to learn how to be a weightlifter because that's where everything came from at the start of kind of this era. Now gyms were opening and it was relatively intimidating. It was a niche thing. So, hey, just do one set to failure. You get everything you need out of it and you're off to the races. And I think the operational definition of need is somewhat dependent upon what are your needs, what are your goals, and what are you trying to accomplish. So I think a lot of people would say, listen, if I'm going to do really low volume, then I should train to failure for hypertrophy to make it as effective as possible. And while I think that's true, there's actually a little more nuance to it than that. Likewise, just because you are doing a high volume program doesn't necessarily mean that doing all those sets to failure wouldn't produce a greater stimulus. So need is also dependent upon how quickly you can grow and what type of growth do you want to expect, and what are you currently adapted to. So if you take someone who's off the street, you and I both know this, if let's say they're in decent shape, but they're not trained, and they are not someone with obesity, right? So they're not carrying a tremendous amount of body weight around. They could probably put a barbell on their back and do a double-digit number of decent depth squats based upon their mobility. But they have literally never done a barbell squat before. They have done a couple of body weight squats, dropping their keys and then dropping them again accidentally type of deal, right? So you could probably restrict them to just doing sets of 5 with 20 kilos on their back, which might be a 10 to 15 RIR, and would keep extending as they got stronger and stronger. And they would probably get stronger and grow muscle on the order of months, just doing 1 or 2 sets of a set of 5 on the bar. And then eventually that would turn into a warm-up for the set that never came, and they would stop growing. So I think it's important to understand that the ability to do more than you're currently at is there, in terms of progressive overload, but you don't need to necessarily always do that to get an adaptation. So if we look at the biggest data set on this, which I would recommend people take a look at, the meta regression by Robinson, I think it's if we look at the hypertrophy data specifically, it's around 1,600 people. And you see this linear relationship of hypertrophy as you get closer and closer to failure with all else equal. So that's kind of like controlling for quote unquote volume, load, literally everything else, and just looking at that independent relationship, which is hard to wrap your head around. But it shows a pretty clear relationship where the closer you get to failure, you get a greater stimulus. So that makes the Mike Menser crowd happy. But what doesn't make them happy is when you look to the right on that x-axis and you see that you still get an average stimulus for growth even past 10 RIR. So I think that is something that conflicts directly with the anecdotes of people in the high intensity crowd. But I think there's probably a reason for that when you are doing very low volume, the stimulus is quite low. So if you're doing low volume far from failure, you're probably not going to see much growth at all. And especially when you're talking about more advanced lifters, if they're taking a low volume approach and they're already throttled as far as their rate of growth that they can achieve, if you do things that constrain that rate of growth even further, it looks like imperceptible rates of growth. So for hypertrophy, training closer to failure does give you a greater stimulus, and your need to train closer to failure is very much dependent upon what level and pace of growth are you okay with, and then the interactions with your expertise at gauging RIR, how many reps you're doing, and the type of movement. All of those things are going to impact the context of when you might decide to be closer or further from failure, which we'll talk about. And then the interesting thing in that same analysis by Robinson, they had a little more data on strength, and they found no relationship between being closer to failure and training for strength. But there's also a really important caveat there, is that that's controlling for load. So if you put 80% of one arm on the bar and you put 90% of one arm on the bar, you have different RIR options. You can't do 90% at a 7 RIR, or it's not 90% of 1 RM, right? But you can with 80%, right? You can do a single at 80%, you can do a single at 90%, and that RIR, independent of the load, will not be better for strength. The single with 90% would probably be slightly better for strength because of the load being higher. So that is probably a tougher one for people to wrap their head around, because load dictates RIR to a degree, or at least constrains what you can achieve. But when you remove that conceptually rather than in reality, because you can't extract the two, it is not the RIR of heavy loads that makes you better at strength. It is the load of heavy loads that makes you better at strength.
That actually does make a lot of sense. We've got a lot of corners to dig into, but you said something, I think, this is sort of a blunt hammer of a statement, but when I see people making certain absolute statements about training and, absolute need to go to failure, or we'll get into this about, this effective reps, the last 5 reps are the only thing that matter, which often leads to an argument that, you don't need anything more than 6 reps for hypertrophy. When I hear those things said as pure absolutes, I know that this is someone who has not trained real people in person across different demographics ever or for a very long time. These are people LARPing as on the internet as research interpreters, and I will die on that hill. And I see a lot of this stuff. You're taking everything to failure, as you alluded to. Not every exercise practically makes sense to failure. Barbell bench pressing, barbell squatting, they don't usually work well to absolute failure, especially if you're not always there to spot that person. They have some of their training on their own, not practical, not safe. Okay. A lot of compound exercise in general. Some things fine. A dumbbell row, no problem. It scales really well. If you get it too heavy, you don't quite hit your intended reps. The thing doesn't come up anymore. You're not dropping on yourself. You're probably not made JJ. You're in a Nautilus glute drive. I've got one in my basement. I like the thing. It gets stuck at the bottom. There's really no real risk if you actually smash the thing up against failure. Bicep curls, generally not a problem, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a lot of exercises that I don't think work very well practically. And then there's the different demographics. Maybe younger guys who are pretty resilient, they can smash their head against a wall pretty good for a while. But you try to take, I think demographically, most, not all, but most women, especially general population, especially inexperienced ones that, they don't see themselves as meatheads in the gym. They just want to get stronger and build bone mass. Older adults, certainly, it's not the absolute statement that they can't train to failure, but, again, if they're newer to it. And there's just a lot of general population that I don't think this works in an absolute for.
Yeah, I would agree with that largely. I think if we want to make kind of, any generalized statement is going to be wrong in some cases, but those are some useful guidelines that are right in more cases than they're wrong. Like I could say, hey, if I do a drop set on bench press and I do 10 reps with 100 kilos, and not to failure, I just stop it when I think I couldn't get another one. And then I drop to 80 and then I drop to 60. I could go to failure on 60 because I'm someone who could do 10 reps with 100. So then I'm just like, let it rest on my chest for a second. I can still breathe. I'm not trapped. I'm not dead. I can roll it down and do the goofy hip thrust thing and dump a plate on one side, or I can just rest long enough and then just heave ho and actually press it up to the first rack and get up underneath it. And I quite regularly do that because I do like to go to failure on a pressing exercise, and someone might be in the Smith, So that, I think that type of nuance and caveat is important. Also, there's a big difference in what people mean when they say failure. Everything that I described earlier was using the definition of failure that is most objective in the literature, which is momentary failure. Sometimes called momentary muscular failure. I like momentary failure because you don't know why they failed. You hope it was muscular, but it could have just been they couldn't do another one for some gestalt reason, which we'll talk about. And in the training world, sometimes people use technical failure, or sometimes people will use volitional failure or perceptual failure, right? So they're not actually being pushed to the point where they fail a rep, and they're going until they don't think they could do another one. It was just more akin to, say, a 0 RIR or a 10 RPE. It's not technically failure. So it's important to talk about the same thing. And I think the most important one to discuss is technical failure, where at a certain point, we're subjectively deciding that is no longer a rep that counts. You have failed technically. That RDL has become a deadlift squat type of deal thing. That bench press didn't touch your chest. You squatted high. We're cutting it off because you're unable to maintain the movement requirements, right? And I think a great arbiter of across all those populations and demographics and systems, or rather circumstances you discussed, to decide when is failure more appropriate is when the person has the capacity to make momentary failure and technical failure get really, really close to one another, right? That demonstrates that someone has not only the skill of lifting, but also the skill of lifting near failure. And that is when you can take some of those more risky movements, some of those populations who you don't want to have an injury because there's higher cost to it. They may not recover as quickly. And you can start to use those techniques. And you also need to make sure that they are robust to it. Because when you have someone who does have the ability to have their technical failure and their true momentary muscular failure pretty close together, they often are quite strong for their own capabilities. And they can quite well dig themselves into a pretty good recovery hole if, say, they're not adapted to doing a decent volume at failure. But if they do adapt to that, you'd be surprised at the things that people can, especially high-level athletes with a decent training background, good engine, who have an aerobic, base, as well as they tend to be the type of person who stops getting sore after a decent amount of repeated bout effect, because everyone experiences the repeated bout effect where soreness, muscle damage is attenuated over time or lessened as you get exposed to a different training stimulus. But some people, when they reach kind of their let's say maximum recoverable volume of work they're doing, they're still getting a degree of soreness that maybe alters movement patterns they don't like, or changes their perceptual ability to feel recovered, or actually maybe a bottleneck to doing further work. So it's not something that I think is a good idea, even though it's frequently done, just to hop between like a high volume, farther from failure program to a low volume, all the way to failure program. But it's better than if you just went from moderate volume further from failure to high volume all the way to failure, right? So you have to think about where you've been to decide where you want to go.
I'll interrupt this episode for a quick but important side quest. While I don't think everybody needs to track nutrition all the time, tracking is one of the most powerful tools to make sure you're not eating too much or too little. And Macros First is my go-to app for me and my clients. Macros First has a free barcode scanner, and a premium version comes with a bunch of cool stuff to make managing your nutrition easier. Like, 1, AI search. AI is everywhere now, where you can speak or type the foods you wish to save and log everything without having to search for each individual ingredient. 2, import recipes from a website. Save time creating recipes manually by importing all ingredients and instructions from your favorite recipe websites. No more searching for each ingredient one by one, just paste in the website. And 3, this one's a big one for nutrition coaches. Follow unlimited friends so you can follow all your clients. And there's a lot more cool features. You can try the premium version of Macros First free for 14 days. Just download Macros First from the App Store. And during setup, you'll be asked, how did you hear about us? Type in the code Andrew. You said something in there that's worth jumping on. it's about if you get really good and skilled at, because absolutely I agree. And I think, because it may sound counter to what I said earlier, but I actually think everybody does need to learn the skill of how to get near failure and develop the actual stamina, both the stamina to train that way, but also the mental fortitude to endure that kind of tough training. But what are the arguments that I'll see from the low volume, higher intensity crowd is that if you're effectively training to failure, then you've generated too much fatigue to then like do subsequent sets well. And then they're also arguing an extension of that is, well, the people who are doing more sets aren't training to failure. They're not training with enough intensity. But if they did train enough with intensity, you wouldn't need the added sets. Can you unpack all that?
Yeah, it's a good circular argument. And it also doesn't require you to look at research that contradicts it. You should, but it doesn't require you to hold one of these beliefs because if you maintain a certain silo of people who never attempt to do higher volume and have a belief that any training that is not to failure is inherently less effective, then you can have that be an internally consistent, always supported argument by what you view. But as soon as you said how like people expose themselves as being, like armchair interpreters of research. I would say some of the things you hear, you also know they've actually never trained a diverse group of people in person. So it's like you really are just an influencer. You don't understand the research and you don't work with people and you basically just have sycophants around you, or you are one of those sycophants and you just get reinforced anecdotes in a small silo, to be perfectly honest. So I think I have had the benefit because I was, siloed of moving into various strength sports. You hear stuff in, say, the powerlifting community that you go to strongman and it breaks their brains. The ways that supposedly super heavyweights can train. Now you look at all super heavyweights at the highest level who are training with a higher frequency, volume, closer to failure, and multiple days, 5 events, yet they're somehow able to do it. And these guys actually used to be those super heavyweights who thought they couldn't do that. So we see the effect of a training effect. That's one where you get a little more
question to drop in there, because it's not, is there an element of survivorship bias in the elites there where they can actually, they can endure that kind of training?
Probably. But I think it's also worth noting that humans are not built to be strength athletes, out of all the primates out there, we are primarily built to be ultra endurance athletes who just keep running until the gazelle gets tired. And, almost everyone can get pretty damn good at being an endurance athlete relative to where they started. Doesn't mean everyone's going to be an elite ultra endurance runner. And everyone can get stronger, but not everyone can get a tremendous amount bigger, so I think there's always going to be survivorship bias to a certain extent, but we also have really good data. Like, for example, there's studies on a decreasing rest interval where you start with 2 minutes, minute and a half, minute, 30 seconds, and you get to a rest interval that in aggregated data would indicate it should harm your ability to grow, but doesn't in that study for 2 reasons. One, they didn't spend the whole period of the study at 30 seconds, only the end. And 2, maybe they built up to it. And when we look at the data on drop sets, when we look at the data on myoreps, rest pause, antagonist paired sets, we do see that these things generate more cardiorespiratory fatigue. You maintain a higher heart rate. But if you are able to get the same amount of volume and you are able to train close to failure, despite that fatigue, people are growing a similar amount. But before I get into the data, I want to continue with some of these different silos and exposure. So that's one anecdote where you see powerlifters converting over to strongmen, maybe some survivorship bias, almost certainly at the highest level, not necessarily survivorship bias, but at least only the people who can be elite strongmen are elite strongmen, right? That's just the way sport works. But you can only be an elite strongman as well if you're also as strong as an elite super heavyweight powerlifter. So there's a barrier to entry, right? Another thing, though, is when you compare weightlifters to powerlifters at the same level. So now we're not talking about necessarily having an entirely different like level or survivorship bias. Like if you're someone who is an 80th percentile powerlifter or an 80th percentile weightlifter, you see very different beliefs about training frequency. And some of that's because there's not much of an eccentric. The loads are lower. You're moving faster in Olympic weightlifting. But those things, when they change what you can handle. But when you take weightlifters and then they do powerlifting, they're often able to train more frequently. And they can do things because they've just been exposed to it. And also the cross-pollination of CrossFit and Olympic weightlifters, we start to see that, man, once the weightlifters kind of get exposed, because the second most common piece of training equipment in a pure weightlifting gym, besides the barbells, is folding chairs, they start to realize that they could actually maybe train a little more frequently and like every minute on the minute and do the things that high-level CrossFitters do, and they get in better shape, So I have found personally, as someone who has now done a lot higher volume than I used to, and I'm not alone in this, and a lot higher volume and close to failure, that the things that I can do now that I have built myself up to be able to do, I didn't think I could have done previously. And I never would have tried them because the constraints and the environment and the beliefs the silo is in would suggest you never should do that, right? And what I mean is, like, I could do a set of a 15, I could do a 15 RM, so to a 10 RPE, 0 RIR set on leg press. And I've gotten pretty strong. I'm actually the strongest I've ever had then. So we're talking 8 plates a side, 320 kilos per side on, and touching my chest with my knees. And then I could rest 2 minutes and I could probably get 12 or 13 or 14 reps with it and then hit failure. If I had done that 6, 7, 8 years ago, 2 minutes later, I would not have been able to get 10 reps. And I would have been like, I just need to rest longer and not do a superset with it like I do now, something like a single joint movement. So the other thing that I think people just have not been exposed to is they're clearly not a multi-sport strength conditioning coach. Anyone who's worked with endurance athletes, they're getting exposed to resistance training, and then they develop some skill with it. And especially if they're in some certain types of endurance, like track cycling, where these guys and gals can go to a true failure set in a moderate rep range with decent loads, and then they're talking to you after a minute because they have such a finely tuned high-level aerobic system, and they recover very, very quickly. So I think a lot of the preconceptions we have about frequency of training, volume, rest periods, recovery, and what is the actual bottleneck to performance are self-perpetuated by the way we train. If you come from a belief system where it got pretty crazy back in the day with HIIT, that you can only train a muscle every fortnight to failure, and then like you got to recover and you shouldn't even do like yard work, then yeah, you're going to be a deconditioned, pretty out of shape, low volume specialist. And then if all of a sudden you try to do high volume, it's not going to go well, because frankly, you're just out of shape, So when I've gone through periods of lower volume approaches of pure powerlifting and then switched to bodybuilding, it's really hard. When you talk to weightlifters or powerlifters who take an approach of more traditional periodization, where they come out of a contest prep, where they've tapered and they've gone through a linear approach, so where they're basically at their most explosive, strongest, and ready to perform, 6 or 9 maxes on a day, and that's it. And then the coach goes, right, we're jumping into 10 by 10 on Monday, which is a common, hate yourself approach to old school weightlifting and powerlifting, more so weightlifting. You get bodied, but then all of a sudden you're better again, So it's this, I think it is a self-perpetuating myth. And especially if you have an ideological belief around what is hard or what you're supposed to do, then it gets, self-reinforced. But we have enough anecdotes in bodybuilding of people doing high volumes that works pretty well. And a lot of them are also doing high volumes pretty close to failure. So I think it's a tough one, man. Like, that belief system is one that is inherently attractive because it tells you can do less and get more. It also focuses on important big rocks, like progressive overload is built in. You are making each set as effective as possible. But I find that it doesn't work for a lot of people long-term to make progress. If you coach enough people in the space of hypertrophy, it's like low volume programs are just not that effective They're really useful for people who have been too focused on volume at the expense of quality, at the expense of RIR, or they're early in their career. They don't need high volumes to have a decent rate of growth. And chasing high volumes has actually impeded their quality. I've actually plenty of times, many, many times, maybe dozens, I have taken bodybuilders early in their career, or competitive or recreational, and I have cut their volume, and we've worked on proximity to failure, better exercise selection, and trying to get, like I said, technical and actual failure closer together. And then just being more intentional and emphasizing the movement more purposefully. And they've grown by quote unquote reducing volume, but the actual stimulus, the dose, was higher, when it really comes down to it.
And I'll go a little somewhere around these sort of classical arguments of this stuff. And I'm probably oversimplifying a little bit, but whenever we hear about low volume stuff, there's only two names that ever come up: Mike Mentzer and Dorian Yates. You said them earlier. They're the only notable names. They're the only people anyone ever references for this to actually work, which leave
Jordan Peters in the modern era. There's a few others. Like you will find people who
But you know what I mean? Like, there's 3, there's 4, whereas there's hundreds upon hundreds that ostensibly do a more classical method, right? 2, anecdotally, by a number of individuals who were around Mentzer in his early to mid-career, claim that Mentzer actually built his physique on more traditional bodybuilding methods, right? There are some people who like to argue that, but a lot of people have claimed that. 3, and this is also really important anytime that anyone is talking about elite bodybuilders, they have the best genetics. So what you said about the strong men earlier, right? It's also true about the elite bodybuilders. And they also had access to cutting edge pharmaceuticals as well. So there's other factors that go in there. And I would even go as far as to say, from what I've seen about Dorian's style of training, his intensity was so high that even though he was doing fewer sets, his volume of training was actually higher than a lot of people believe it was. Is that fair?
Yeah, if you just watch Blood and Guts, you'll be like, oh, he didn't count that as a set. Like, he does some warm-ups, some pre-exhaust, and like he's finishing. And when you have to work up to over 4 plates on incline, like there's some pretty bonkers things that have to go into just getting yourself ready. I think another thing to realize is that anecdotes have gotten progressively more contaminated over time because of the siloing effect of social media. Like, if you want an actual observational anecdotal take on what do bodybuilders do, and we assume that we should probably, assume that they're collectively at least on point enough, you need to look at a survey, an actual open survey that has access, anyone can access, that gets shared and is randomly responded to, and you can start to look at different categories, natural versus enhanced. And what we see in the biggest and most recent surveys is that bodybuilders, I'm talking direct sets, not even indirect, the way they'd be counted in some of the data that is like, from experimental studies, is they're doing, if you're talking about just the standard, like one standard deviation out, it's like 12 to 25 sets per muscle group per week. That's moderate to moderately high volume, and the way I would describe it. So that is what the majority of bodybuilders do. And so is it a useful anecdote to point out the relatively rare group that doesn't even necessarily consistently, like, you don't see it in champions or pros or anything like that. You don't see a consistent pattern of low volume. You see almost exclusively what I would describe as moderate low to moderate high volumes at all levels in physique sport.
And funny, this sort of contaminates things even further, because I think back to my earlier days of training where I made profound progress in muscle building. And I would, people laugh at bodybuilding magazine programs, but guess what? I put on a shit ton of muscle in my early 20s. Again, prime anabolic conditions for that. I ate for it. But I grew really well on those style of programs, a variety of different exercises. But when I think about it, it's like I did ascending pyramids. And guess what I did? You warm up, you warm up, you warm up, you do a top set, and then you move on. And there was a lot of that. I saw great growth on that. So that's actually still kind of on the lower end of volume when you think about it, right?
Yeah, I think we don't quite like to accept, because it's not a fun story, how much gains slow with our training age. The closer you get to the most amount of muscle mass that you'll build in your lifetime before sarcopenia starts to defeat you or push you the other way, the slower gains come. And that's a logarithmic effect. So the things that were like suboptimal rates of growth in our first 2 years of training will be probably tenfold faster than optimal rates of growth 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years into training. If you've been making a averagely similar rate of growth going through there. And we often have these kind of honeymoon effects or honeymoon biases of looking back on what we did early. And kind of the intermediate trap is looking back over that, grass is greener in the past, rosy-eyed glasses. And we try the thing that we did back in the day that worked really well, and it just doesn't reproduce. And that's philosophically not just in training, the bulking that we try to do when we're like mistaking wrinkles in our belly fat is that an ab? Like maybe I'm still 15%. It's like, bro, you don't need to be eating 1,000 calorie surplus every day right now. So when you cut down, you're going to be disappointed that you're 1 pound heavier than you were last time you got here. And that's actually good progress, right? That's the kind of thing that is, and you can't convince someone of that until you've been in the game long enough to see it over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? Because you don't want it to be true, right? So it's difficult to be objective about something you've never experienced and that you really don't want to be true. So I think that is a tough thing. So low volume programs in newbies versus high volume programs in advanced lifters. Even though they are quite different, man, the major player there in terms of what's the best possible outcome, besides genetics or what we might quote unquote categorize as genetics, is going to be the fact that one person, best case scenario, is going to grow 1/10 the speed of the other person, no matter what.
So we've danced around it. So this narrative that we often see that, again, you only need to train one hard set to failure. And then I've seen people citing data that says, second set, the diminishing returns are so rapid that it's almost no point in doing even a second set. Can you explain why do people believe that? What's the truth?
Yeah, so there is absolutely, to steelman this argument, diminishing returns from more and more and more sets being performed in session, within week, no matter how you dice it. And we've got pretty large scale, robust data with a decent amount of certainty, up till pretty high volumes, like 20, 25 plus indirect sets per week, or more than say 10 or 11 sets indirect per session for hypertrophy, that indicate that is the case. But what is a fabrication of that, or a distortion of that, probably better said, is that it actually becomes negative or pointless at that low of a volume. I would absolutely accept someone saying, yeah, once you've hit more than 10 sets for a muscle group in a session, you're better just to wait until you're recovered and do it again. But if they said 1 set in a session, that I'm going, well, show me the data, So I think that's really the inverted U in the data, at least, where you start to actually get a negative outcome or it's harmful to you, is not there. And the full plateauing effect is also not there. What we actually have statistically is an uncertainty of whether or not the growth is greater than the collective variance or measurement noise or uncertainty that we have in the data, because we don't have enough studies. And when you're growing slowly, because every single additional set is proportionally less helpful, you're trying to measure a very, very, very small change, right? So I mentioned Robinson, and now we're going to talk about Pelland as well as Remmert. The same group that did that analysis of RIR also has analyzed the interaction of frequency and volume for strength hypertrophy in both a per session and a per week basis, using what's described as fractional sets. I said indirect earlier, but fractional is actually the technical terminology. So you'd count movements where you're directly training that single muscle as a 1-to-1 basis, and if it's trained indirectly, the data would indicate it's a slightly better fit to count it as half a set. Now, that's not a reality. It's not actually true that a bench press is half as good for your tricep as it is for your pecs, and that all compound movements that include elbow extension are equally and half as good as they are for your pecs, for your triceps, but it is a useful way of describing the data that seems to comport with it, big picture. So now we're talking about almost 36 studies across slightly over 1,000 people, and we have this pretty clear relationship up to roughly 11 sets per session, or right around the 25, maybe 30 if you want to use the pairwise comparisons, 30 sets, fractional sets per week per muscle group. And at that point, it's unclear if you're getting, more benefits. And that might also really only apply in the types of designs we see where people are training 2 to 3 times per week. And these are on volumes that are 70 to 80% of them to a definition of failure. And the 20 to 30% of the remaining studies, they aren't far from failure. They're just not necessarily to failure. They're probably in the 1 to 3 RIR range in most cases. So that's taking that into account. But it's on mostly untrained people and recreationally trained people with some decently trained people. So those are limitations, as is that the average study length is 10 weeks and that they're not always doing what you would describe as ecologically valid, realistic training protocols. There's often a bias towards the muscle groups that are being measured. And sometimes these are studies where it is a single muscle group being trained in an untrained group. It's a bicep study, right? But it's also mixed in sometimes with a more full body program, or they're doing a allowable amount of volume on other muscle groups because they're trying to recruit trained people, and trained people are not just going to do legs. They're going to okay, we'll observe you and you can do this additional volume on these specific muscle groups, but we can't have you do extra because it'll mess up the study type of deal. So when we look at all of that aggregated, that pattern emerges where, yes, absolutely, Steelman, the case, diminishing returns do exist, but it is a poorer and poorer investment from a per set stimulus basis, rather than it becoming something that is actually clearly harming you in the short term, slowing down your progress, or plateauing so early that it would be a poor decision to do more volume. Now, the practical constraints, your exercise selection, what you're previously adapted to, what your goals are, may make that a really, really poor decision, where if you're trying to get imperceptibly greater levels of growth and you're impinging upon your time or recovery abilities or your enjoyment, you are risking burnout, overuse, things that probably won't show up in a 10-week study that we are pretty aware of as coaches and as athletes ourselves. Or if you're trying to accomplish these levels of volume tomorrow, because let's say you used to think that 8 sets is where it would top out, and then you kind of got out of that silo and you saw the study and you're like, oh, wow, well, if I can benefit from 30, I should start doing 30 sets. That would be a tremendously bad idea. And people do that shit all the time, though. They just shift to what's optimal rather than realizing that it might take you the better part of 2 years to build up the capacity to train to the same degree of intensity, effort, intent, and without pacing yourself or having to change exercise selection to easier things that maybe don't have the same challenge of a resistance curve or what have you, from doing 8 sets that are effective and hard and the best you can do them at the same quality to doing 30. That would, if you get there at all, that does take years to develop that kind of workload capacity, resilience, and focus.
And the time, like as a practical constraint, the time to be able to do this probably makes it hard to access for most people, certainly the recreational person who just wants to get strong and put on muscle, right?
Yeah, I will say it makes no sense for the typical person to try to max out that dose response curve. The typical person, even though they say they want to grow as fast as possible, there's actually some constraints around there that are the real bottleneck. Okay, can you train twice a day, 7 days a week? No, that's crazy. I wouldn't want to, even if that would get me to grow faster. Oh, okay. So it's not actually I'll do anything, right? Would you like to take anabolic steroids? No. Okay, cool. Okay. So what are the constraints? Well, I don't want to break the law. I got 4 hours per week that I can dedicate. I can train Tuesday, Thursday, and then Saturday, Sunday for an hour. Okay, cool. Now I know what we're working with. So within the constraints of 4 hours per week and doing things that seem sane to you, you will do whatever you want to grow as fast as possible. Okay, cool. So we're going to do all supersets, drop sets, and rest pause to get as much volume as we can. We're going to take all sets to failure. And we're going to use all long muscle length training. How does that sound? No. That's I wouldn't enjoy that. I like to talk to my friends a little bit. Like, what do you like? I enjoy the gym. I have a workout partner, and also I'm going to be in my work clothes. Like, I can't be that sweaty. I got to go after, Oh, okay. So You need to do something that you enjoy, that you have a little bit of social interaction. And then all of a sudden you start to realize that there are constraints which are going to dictate the amount of work and how hard someone work does for now. And you can work towards improving that. And then you just tell the person, okay, here's what we got. We're looking at 12 sets, these exercises per muscle group per week. And here's how it's going to be organized. And that's a pretty good return on investment. When you're operating in, say, like the 4 to 10 or even 4 to 15 set range, I would say you're getting a pretty damn good return on investment per set. Once you start to get above that, you better have a damn good reason, and there's potentially different decisions you would make in different volume ranges. So let's take a step back, and I'll try to speak a little bit conceptually, statistically, but not have anyone's eyes glaze over or their brains hurt. The relationship of RIR and Robinson was what we describe as a linear relationship. That's kind of the way our brains think, meaning that on average, even though it's very, very small, the difference of going from an 8 RIR to a 5 RIR is roughly the same as going from a 5 RIR to a 2 RIR, right? In both cases, you've gotten 3 reps closer to failure. And in each case, the absolute change is getting higher and higher and higher as you get closer and closer to failure. And it's similarly beneficial in terms of the change that you're getting. And doing 8 RIR, 5 RIR, and 3 RIR, each one of those in a linear fashion is getting you more stimulus on average. Like I mentioned, though, the sets data shows a diminishing relationship, meaning that on a per set basis, going from, say, 4 sets to 8 sets is giving you more per set than when you go from 8 sets to 12 sets. And you get to the point to where if you want to get the same benefit of 10 sets, right, that you got from doing, say, 0, you'd have to do 30. So now instead of just adding another 10 sets, you got to add another 20. So now you're basically doing 3 moderate volume programs in the same week to get twice the gains that you got from 1 moderate volume program, right? So that is kind of what we're talking about here. So if someone comes to me as a trainer or asks a theoretical question of what's better, volume or intensity, I'm like, where are you at currently? If you're currently doing 4 sets to a 3 RIR, if you showed that to the HIIT crowd, they would say, listen, you got the right amount of volume, but you're just not bringing the heat. Let's get those 4 sets to failure. And it would be true that they would get better gains. Absolutely. And if you only have the time, willingness, or ideology that allows you to do 4 sets, you better fucking take them to the house. Pardon my French. Yes, they should be to failure, right? Because that is the constraint. You're only going to do a low volume program. Okay, we better milk it for everything we're worth. Like, let's try to improve the resistance profile, maybe get you in the stretch position a little bit, make sure that we're, we got a spotter, because maybe we're going to take some to even like lengthen partial failure. We're going to do a beyond quote unquote failure set just to really get the most out of that we can, if that's allowed in your ideology. But if someone is not ideologically attached nor time constrained, I would go, you know what? You would actually get more out of going from 4 sets to 8 sets and staying at a 3 RIR, because of that. You're on that steepest part of the beneficial curve of that diminishing returns relationship. And it's actually a really flat line if you look at the RIR relationship. Going from 3 to 2 to 1, it's a little bit better, but not much. So if someone was like, hey, I could do more, and I want to get more out of this, I'd be like, yeah, sure, certainly train closer to failure. But I mean, do you have more than 15 minutes a week? Because it really doesn't take that much to do 4 sets per muscle group, right? So, oh, yes, I do. Cool. Let's get you into that 6 to 10 range. You'll probably notice a pretty big difference. Now, if someone comes to me and they're like, hey, Eric, I'm clocking 20 sets per week already, and my growth rate's not that good. I look at their training program and I see that they're at a 4 RIR on average. And they're like, well, what do you think about me going to 25 sets? And I'm like, the same RIR? And they're like, yeah. And, I've read the volume on data. I know it will be better. I know it's diminishing though. And also, you don't get much out of getting a little closer to failure. I'm like, yeah, on average, but you have 20 opportunities to get each one of those little benefits. So like, if we take 4 sets at an average of a 3 RIR and we move to a 1 RIR, that's only 4 little bumps for each one of those muscles of being slightly closer to failure. But if you're doing 20 sets at a 4 RIR, even just going to a 3 RIR, That is 20 small, additional, incremental, linear increases in your stimulus. So yes, if you can maintain that volume and increase your intensity, quote unquote, a little bit, get a little bit closer to failure, it might be better. Hell, we could go to 15 sets and take them all to failure, and it might be better than doing 20 sets at a 4 RAR. And people struggle with that interacting, changing relationship between those variables.
A quick break from this episode to shout out RP Strength and the RP Hypertrophy app. I have a big confession. I've never used a coach before. I've always auto-regulated my training for decades. But I've known Dr. Mike Isertel and Nick Shaw, the founders of RP, for years, and I'll get behind anything they create, including years of reading their books, consuming their media, attending their seminars, and having them as guests on the show. And I've been using the RP Hypertrophy app now for several months. And several things have happened. It forced me to make smaller and more gradual but better increases in weight volume across time, like putting 5-pound plates on each side of a leg press. Like, who does that? Never before. Only 45s. It cut out the junk volume. It made my workouts faster and more efficient. I show up with a plan. I didn't have to think about what to do. I feel more accountable having a log my progress. And I don't skip things because I don't feel like it. If hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to manage your gains and to take the guesswork out of your program. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free, and if you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got you a $50 US dollar discount, so go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes. That's rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP. All right, so another one of the narratives that pops up that is at least adjacent to this and oftentimes gets meshed in is only the last 5 reps count, often termed effective reps. Everything else is junk volume. Is this accurate? Is it useful? Is it misleading?
Accurate, useful, and misleading. It is inaccurate, potentially useful, and misleading for certain populations. So this is almost like, what's the game where you marry someone, you kill somebody, and you have sex with someone else? So the slightly different answer for each one. I think it is potentially useful if you're talking to people who are maybe no longer beginners. They have the ability to gauge proximity to failure, and maybe that is the thing that they could do better on. They're holding back a little bit, and they would get a greater stimulus from training closer to failure, because anything that constrains your rate of growth when you're an advanced lifter can sometimes functionally result in the perception of no progress, because you're growing so slow that it is either totally unmotivating and you would take you multiple years to see that you even made any progress, or it's so slow that it might effectively be zero progress, even if you are very slowly growing, right? So I do think that even well-trained lifters can grow at a 10 RAR, right? With sufficient volume. But people talk as though failure is this changing relationship. And I think it kind of is, but not really with training age. So as I mentioned earlier, someone who's just off the street, because they are adapted to literally nothing, we have data indicating that walking programs can actually grow a little bit of lean mass in untrained sedentary individuals. What RNR is walking at? I don't know, but it is pretty far from failure. And the point is, for that person, it is more exposure to muscle tension, and it's a lot more than they've ever done. So they actually do grow. There is a point when a walking program will not help you grow anymore, right?
I won't grow.
No matter how much you walk.
I won't grow from walking, but I still do it for other reasons.
Correct. And more importantly, so if you took a walking program that would take one of your sedentary clients and put muscle growth on them, and you said, okay, cool, that's a stimulus for growth. I'm advanced. I just grow slower. That's fine. I'll just stop training and only do their walking program. You would lose muscle. So we do understand that there is, in reality, essentially what I would describe as not necessarily a ceiling change, but a floor change as you adapt and as you adapt. The minimum effective dose to observe hypertrophy and not lose muscle mass does increase, even if necessarily you don't need, quote unquote, more volume. But the perception of more volume being more beneficial for advanced lifters has to do more with their diminishing returns rate of growth, this logarithmic slowing of growth. If you can offset that to some degree, even a small degree, you can actually perceive progress and actually know, I'm adding a rep here and there. And that's exceedingly hard to do with a very low volume program for more advanced lifters. And that's why they even trend, even some of the greats we've talked about, they've had phases of high volume training, or if you look at their program a little more holistically, you're like, yeah, some of that volume that you don't count because you think only the last 5 reps or sets to failure count probably is contributing here, So I think that's worth pointing out. The data pretty strongly indicates that yes, advanced lifters do need a higher dose just to maintain where they're at, but they're able to grow in a similar pattern and from the same stimulus, just the total amount is less. So the failure and the volume relationship, I don't actually think changes for advanced lifters. It's just overlaid on those two things, higher floor and then diminishing returns rate of growth. So ultimately that means that things that are suboptimal for advanced lifters can become suboptimal enough to effectively result in a plateau. But the reason why I think it's potentially not ideal for untrained people is that you absolutely can grow off of a 6 RIR set and almost exclusively like 6 to 8 RIR training. And when you look at the training like research out there where they use kind of percentage 1RMs and reps, and they start with a fixed 1RM based upon a 1RM they tested in untrained people, one, they can't even express a full 1RM. This is why an untrained person on a leg press, if they do a max and then they immediately see how many reps they can get with, say, 80% of 1RM, they're going to get like 15 reps, which immediately, if you said, I did 15 reps of that, it was 80%. And you're like, no, it's not. Or every time you tested them on a 1RM, it would be higher for like 3 times in a row. And if you did it once a month, they would get stronger for several months because they're still learning the skill. They can't even tap into their actual 1RM. So you see these things in research where people are growing and getting bigger because everything is novel. Everything's an exposure. Their ceiling is so far away and the floor is so low that they can train at a 10 RIR because it is a very different than what they've done. That changes, right? But I do think training at, let's say a 4 to 8 RIR on average with sufficient volume can overcome that. And this is where it helps to be in different silos. So there was a time period, and you and I would both remember this, where like say Shaiko was all the rage. This is a high frequency, high volume, but actually pretty high RIR, far from failure protocol. Almost all the loads are 65% to say 80, 85%, but almost all the reps are in the 2 to 5 range, right? So we're talking about 1RMs that on average people can do 15 reps with, but they're doing on average maybe 4 reps. So not always, but then they're doing successive sets, right? You do a whole bunch of sets. So you start to induce fatigue so that now your subsequent sets are a little bit closer to failure. But I would say the average RIR of one of the more aggressive, higher volume Shaiko programs is probably like 6, if you actually mathed it out. And I have seen plenty of advanced powerlifters growing their prime movers on the squat, bench, and deadlift from taking this approach. And I think it's because while the per set stimulus is pretty damn poor, they're getting a lot of sets in. So I do think you can offset a poor RIR selection that does slow down your growth and see that this stuff still does work in advanced lifters if you do enough volume. But I would say if your goal is hypertrophy, you shouldn't do that, right? It makes more sense to train closer to failure and then figure out how much volume you can do when you are training closer to failure. So useful potentially for people who are past their novice stage, who are not training as hard as they could be to get a better rate of gains. Misleading because it applies differently to different populations, and objectively false because we have the Robinson data that shows you're getting an average growth even at a 10 RIR in their main analysis, where we have the most amount of certainty. So yeah, context dependent, as are most things.
And again, this narrative is usually used to justify the need for nothing bigger than, sometimes I hear 4 to 6 reps for hypertrophy. And again, that comes with the implied to near failure. And then there's a practical, it goes back again to different populations, the practicality of using 4 to 6 reps to near failure, depending on the exercise, is pretty challenging stuff, right? And it biomechanically doesn't work very well for a lot of exercises. Again, people training real people in person. Now, there's another narrative that sometimes gets intertwined with this, and it's often that with higher rep ranges, and usually this is even 8 to 12, certainly higher, that it's harder to gauge what true RIR is. Therefore, somehow this is an argument against using those higher reps, when we do know that based on research, a lot of Brad Schoenfeld's work is that you can get good muscle hypertrophy at nearly any rep range as long as you meet certain conditions. It's got to be more than 30% of your 1 rep max to be able to actually get near failure in the first place. You could curl a pencil all day, you're not getting near failure, and it can't be above, I can't remember if it's 85 or 90%. You probably know better than me. There's just a few other caveats to it, but take that one, unpack it.
Yeah, no, this one, it's often used as a justification for saying, oh, we only train in a 5 to 8 rep range at a 2 RIR. Really, really narrow constraints. And this data, I would say, is broadly supportive of it, but there's a ton of limitations, and it's also very limiting. And the claims around it are too absolute. That's what you often see. It's like, oh, there's diminishing returns, so after 1 set, you're not getting any benefit out of it and actually harmful. It's like, oh, if you just stopped with it, there's diminishing returns and not given that crazy thing, and then not created an infographic with literally fake representations that aren't based upon any data, or change it, that mathematically make no sense if you actually think about it. This one, a little less egregious, but if it's used to support that narrow 5 to 8 or 2 RIR, now we're like, okay, that's a limiting and not helpful interpretation of true data. So great meta-analysis that was done in a scoping review by Halpern and colleagues right after COVID that looked at RIR accuracy. And there's a relatively stable relationship and people being pretty accurate, being off by 1 RIR on average, which is good, until you get to around 12 reps. And then the slope just skyrockets up. It becomes highly inaccurate the more you do 12 reps. But how do they figure that out is the big question. And what this is studies that in 8 out of 10 cases are doing squats and bench press with people in the room spotting you, and then between reps, so you're at lockout and you call out an RIR, and then you go to failure until you miss a rep, but you have spotters. And then we compare the difference between the actual RIR and the predicted. So you might have 2 call outs at a 3 and a 1, or a 5 and a 2, or a 4 and a 2. Various study designs have done this and replicated many, many times. And importantly, you're being motivated to train to failure by the people in the room with you. And many times this is explored at moderate loads, like 70%, where people can do 15 to 25 reps in many, many cases, or 80% or higher. So we get this across the loading spectrum. And we do see that pretty reliably when people are predicting how many RIR they have left in a set that contains more than 12, that you get a progressively worse accuracy of rating RIR the higher those reps get. And that is 100% true. We also have data looking at higher rep versus lower rep training and perceptual responses. And importantly, this is also primarily using compound movements. So like lat pull down, bench press, squat, leg press, things like that. If you have people do 8 to 12 reps to failure, typical quote unquote hypertrophy range, they have a slightly positive affect, which is just a Likert scale that goes from like -5 to +5. That's literally just like, did that feel good or bad? It's like a vibes check. It's a validated, reliable scientific vibes check, right? So if you have people do a full body workout consisting of like those exercises I described, failing in the 8 to 12 range, again, being motivated on every set, that, believe it or not, is going to give them a mildly positive vibes check of like 1 point something. You then shift that to failing in the 20 to 30 RM range, and it gets notably negative, like 2 point something. So that is not a fun workout. That is, I tried not to throw up. The RPE, session RPE, not the proximity to failure based RPE, jumps up by about 10% on a 1 to 10 scale on average, maybe a little more. And the rating of discomfort, which is also a validated thing, jumps up by about 2. So part of that probably describes why in these studies, primarily on bench and squat, where you see high rep training on compound lifts to failure becoming inaccurate, because it's really difficult to parse out, can I not do another rep because I'm reaching muscular failure? Or does the world feel like it's imploding on me and I need to stop doing this because I'm going to die from cardiometabolic and perceptual fatigue and soul pain, as you will get from doing multiple compound movement sets on, like, say, squats to failure in the 20 to 30 rep range, if you're even reasonably strong. And a lot of these acute studies, you can do them on pretty well-trained lifters. And in fact, they've been done on power lifters in many cases. I've done some of these studies, right? So that context is really important to understand. They haven't been done on tricep pushdowns or dumbbell lateral raises, right? They haven't been done in situations where the whole workout is known. And they also haven't been done where the person just goes to failure, because there's probably even an influence on the call. Like, oh, I think I got 3 more. And then does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? So there could be an artificial inflation of the accuracy. And that's something I say as someone who advocates for the use of RIR. So there's things that chip away at my argument. There's things that support that argument. But broadly, it tells you that we can't necessarily apply that logic to just saying 5 to 8. So all that aside, those are acute studies. And the actual training studies, where we compare groups doing low reps to moderate reps to high reps, we've got about 4 or 5, believe it or not, that's not that many studies where that's been done, and they're training at a similar RIR or to failure. And we see that kind of the floor, quote unquote, if we're taking sets to failure or near to it, where do you get a similar per set hypertrophy stimulus, not strength and not total, if you're comparing disparate number of sets, is like 4 or 5 reps. So that seems to strengthen that argument of, hey, only the last 5 reps in a set count. If sets of 4 or 5 to failure are just as good as a set of 15, that's where that logic comes from, right? But also, we're looking at individual studies on small sample sizes, and we're saying the rates of growth are not significantly different. We're not saying they're equivalent. And when we actually have large enough data sets, again, looking at thousands of people, 1,500, 1,600, like in Robinson, now we can actually see that there is a small signal in the noise of being closer to failure, even when you're doing more than 5 or 4 rep sets. So it's, beyond that 5 RIR point, there's still a stimulus to be had, right? So yes, there is a linear relationship. Closer you get to failure, the more you get out of it. So by definition, the last 5 reps are more stimulative than the first 5 reps in a 10 rep set, but they're all stimulative on a linear scale. And if the loads are heavy enough, you're starting very close to failure, then all of the reps are more stimulative. And there's 2 pieces of data that I think kind of strongly support the idea that load has an interaction with RIR for hypertrophy. One is a sub-analysis that Robinson did, specifically looking at heavier loads. So they aggregated their data into, I want to say, I can't remember, 3 different percentages of 1RM, but they look at all the studies that were over 90% of 1RM, and they found that there was a flat slope looking at RIR in those studies. So again, remembering that you have a lot of untrained participants, a lot of machine work in the research, there are some studies where you could hit a 7 RIR with 90% of 1RM if you did like a single. And it seems weird to us in kind of our barbell-centric, well-trained lifter minds. But yeah, if you take a recreationally trained woman and you have them do 90% of 1RM on their leg press, they probably could get 8 reps, if you motivated them to go to failure. So anyway, when you are training with heavier loads, you are by definition, as I mentioned earlier, already at a pretty low RIR. You're starting closer to failure. And we also see on data on EMG, which shouldn't be used to infer hypertrophy, but it tells us something about motor unit behavior, that your peaks don't get much higher as you go from, say, 80% of 1RM to higher. And the way we produce more force is what's called an increase in the rate coding, or improvements in other things like coactivation, motor coordination between and within muscles. But ultimately, the way we just simply drive more force output from a given set of muscles in a given motor pattern is just by making them twitch at a higher rate, or rate coding. The motor unit recruitment pattern still stays the same. So everything's turned on in a reasonably heavy set. So all of those quote unquote reps are more likely to quote unquote count if we want to take a kind of a mechanistic motor unit behavior model. When you're doing lower loads, you do see a lower peak EMG, yet you still get to the same place from hypertrophy. How does that happen? Well, it's a phenomenon that is best described and understood called motor unit substitution or motor unit cycling. And the idea here is that our high threshold motor units, which recruit the highest power output but most fatigable muscle fibers, they come in and out to try to preserve their high fatigability because they're important for force production. We want to be able to run from the tiger or do the thing in the midst of a long walk where we're tired, right? We need to get away fast. We need to do explosive things when we're not anticipating it. So we try to preserve their ability to contribute to force. But in a continuous set to failure with high reps, eventually they start to fatigue and you deplete the entire motor unit pool and you can no longer meet the ATP demands by the end of it and you have failure. And if you can do that due to true muscular failure, rather than that haze of cardiometabolic perceptual fatigue and pain that might happen when you're, say, below 30% of 1RM, or probably even higher in load, say 50% of 1RM, when you don't have a team of graduate students yelling at you to go to failure and you're just in your own mind and you hate yourself from trying to do 25 reps on squats, even though that might only be 45, 50% of 1RM. Yeah, I think it's a bad recommendation to do really, really high rep training. And another thing that this crowd does get right, but then over leverages, is that when we look at studies of fatigue, so when can you get back to baseline performance and produce the same levels of force, higher rep sets to failure do produce more fatigue. But it is insufficient to impact long-term hypertrophy in well-trained lifters who are adapted to it. It doesn't apply for all muscle groups because many muscle groups are being trained by, single joint movements that aren't that globally fatiguing. And there is a downside to doing really, really heavy training in low rep ranges near failure of producing a different kind of like mental fatigue and joint pain and stress that might end up becoming the bottleneck long before, your ability to maximally recruit everything tomorrow, just because you went to failure on a leg extension. Maybe just wait 2 days,
It beats the shit out of you if you do too much of it.
Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, practically speaking, I actually like doing a not insignificant amount of stuff in a 3 to 5, 3 to 6 rep range. There's obviously some of it is intent on developing strength in clients. It depends on the population. Not a lot of that's necessarily smashing up against failure. If I've got somebody deadlifting, I'm not going to a 0 RIR with deadlifts on almost anybody in that context. And then a lot of the, the more hypertrophy focused stuff, it practically, experientially works really well in that classic 8 to 12 rep range. It just does from a practical standpoint. I do enjoy personally in my own training, playing around in the 50 to 20 rep range with a few isolation movements. It's great for tricep press down, especially warming up. It's magic for, side laterals with dumbbells. That gets a killer pump. But again, it works for me because I'm more experienced. Do I spend a lot of time with a lot of less experienced clients in those rep ranges? Not really. Do I think it's a great idea for everybody to experience it? Sure. And once in your life, you probably should do a set of 20 to 30 leg press to near failure. But guess what? You're not going to do multiple sets of that week after week after week. As someone who struggles to enjoy the gym in the first place, the diehards will get like sadistic about this sort of crap. But when it comes
don't follow my stories because I don't represent the norm, but I do that.
Yeah, you'd be very much edge of the bell curve for just the passion for this sort of stuff. We also have to remember that we are not representative of most of the people we're trying to help. The last thing, I think you got the time. Let me know if you run into a bottleneck.
I do, totally.
Okay, is the idea of how much of a calorie surplus we need for muscle growth. I came out of the world, again, the bodybuilding magazine stuff. You'd see, and I always use the example of Lee Priest on the before and afters for hydroxycut, where Lee is not a tall man. I actually was talking to him at the Arnold this year, wearing my Arnold shirt, and he would get up to about 300 pounds, I think, in the off season. He was sort of anecdotally known for, eating a lot of fried chicken or what have you. And then he would cut right down. It makes for a great advertisement. But he got away from that, I think, early in his career. And there's, I think, a lot of metabolic health risks that comes with that. But even outside of bodybuilders, we now know that I think moderate surpluses tend to disproportionately accumulate body fat. Can you explain just how much of a surplus someone probably needs to maximize muscle gain, minimize body fat gain?
Yeah, a huge amount of bodybuilding culture, people forget, comes from the necessity of having to get to 4% body fat if you're, say, a male competitive elite level bodybuilder. And that's a terrible place and not conducive to muscle gain. So we have to get out of that state to restore our health to the point where our body is even going to let us grow muscle, if anything else. And that comes with gaining back to a reasonable body fat level. So I bet if you really drilled down with most of the bodybuilders who were getting massive, it was not by choice. It was by cumulative binge eating and justifying it and convincing themselves that it was conducive to their goals, and also massive anabolic steroid support to get there. And we're also talking about an era when they still cycled, not just blast and cruised. So they were probably changing their drugs to be a little more supportive. And a lot of that weight was probably tremendous amounts of water and bloat. Anywho, so you don't need to do the bulk and cut cycles that bodybuilders need to do just from the demands of their sport. If we could just get shredded in our first comp and be like, oh, I'll just stay here and get lean. I mean, stay here and get huge. Then I never have to diet again. That would be wonderful. But there's psychological and physiological reasons why that is not advised and often basically impossible, at least in a practical realm. So the data we have on gaining across maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 studies at most, generally indicates that the size of your surplus should be tailored to the rate of growth you can potentially experience. And I think this connects nicely with our understanding that the more advanced you get, best case scenario, you're gaining at a much slower rate. So when people talk about not needing a surplus to grow, that is context dependent, right? So if you were to take someone in the middle of contest prep and you said, hey, we're just going to keep you here, go to maintenance and see if you can grow, they're going to really struggle to do so because they're in kind of a perpetual state of low energy availability. They're going to have a hormonal, metabolic, and psychological and recovery environment that, regardless of what they do in the gym or in the kitchen, is not going to really support growth, right? They're effectively too lean. And they are below what we would describe as a lower intervention point, to the point where they are adapted to not be able to consume a sufficient amount of calories to get signaling to the hypothalamus to say, hey, we're okay, so that we can actually have some more efficient adaptations to training. So all of that is just an example of one instance where you would need to be in a surplus to grow, because you would need to be in a surplus to get yourself back to a point of health to where growth at all is possible. So there are situations where you do need a surplus, but we also have data showing like, hey, if you take junior sumo wrestlers and you watch them try to put on, muscle mass, they're in a massive surplus. They're very high in body fat, but their body fat percentage actually goes down. They're experiencing a recomp. Sometimes they are either not gaining body fat or they're gaining more muscle mass than the amount of body fat they're gaining. So their percentage body fat goes down. Or we see concurrent losses in, say, American football linemen in D1 during the conditioning phase of the offseason, because they're losing body fat and gaining muscle at the same time. And when you look at it, you realize they're actually in a slight net deficit, because there's 5 to 6 times the energy in fat mass that there is in lean mass on a kilogram per kilogram basis, because lean mass is mostly protein and water. Fat mass is like 90% adipose tissue, which, just as we know from our count in macros, is 4 versus 9 kilocalories per gram, right? So that means in that kilogram of muscle tissue, there's a majority of it that is not protein, and that smaller component that is protein is only 4 kcals per gram. But if 90% of a kilogram, so 900 grams, is 9 kcals per gram, that means when we see no change on the scale, you've gained a kilogram of muscle, you've lost a kilogram of fat, the average trainer, the average person would very intuitively assume, okay, we're at maintenance. No change in scale weight, lost a kilogram of one, gained a kilogram of the other. No, actually, your net deficit was thousands of calories over whatever time period that happened, right? So I think those are interesting examples where we see that muscle growth and scale weight change don't always map onto what we think is happening in a surplus or a deficit. And it helps us understand the observations of, even when we see scale weight change, but we see body recomposition in our novice clients, they're actually in deficit. So we know anyone who's trained someone and they kind of observe that, which I think almost any trainer who has done a decent job has seen this tremendous numbers of times. Like, oh, they lost fat, but they've clearly gained muscle. Or their body weight's the same, but we look back after 6 months. It's pretty common in women who don't want to gain much weight. We kind of have a maintenance-y phase. Like, oh, their body fat percentage is down 4%, but they're at the same weight. They weren't in maintenance. That was actually a deficit. And I think that's something a lot of people don't realize. So we've collectively, even though we don't get that that is a deficit, already accepted that we can build muscle in a deficit until you get to a point where the level of leanness that you're at and the associated calories with it is just maladaptive, right? It is insufficient to support your goals. And on the other side of it, then there's how much of a surplus can you be benefited from? And there's pretty good data on this across a range of training statuses. There's on rank beginners showing that if you overfeed university-aged males who have never trained before, they can benefit from being in pretty damn large surpluses. And they can gain as much as has been observed of almost a pound per week of lean tissue for at least the first 8 weeks of training if you overfeed them quite well and train them hard on average, which is pretty cool, with no change on average in fat tissue. So they gained, 7 kilos in 8 weeks, 3.5 kilos in 8 weeks of body weight and lean mass, no average change in fat mass. And they're being given a 2,000 calorie weight gainer per day on top of their habitual diet. So they compensate in probably less than their habitual diet. Yes. Now,
how much of that
the control group in that, go ahead.
How much of that might be explained by NEAT?
Probably a fair amount. It's like, it's a quote unquote outpatient study, but it's going to be pretty diverse. Some people absolutely university age male exercising. You give them 2,000 calories to eat on top of their diet. Maybe they do stick to it. They're good participants, but they only gain half of what you would anticipate if that put them from maintenance into a 2,000 calorie surplus. That would be explained by NEAT. Many of them, though, however, are going to be unable to eat the same amount, and they won't know that they're changing it in their day-to-day habitual diet, right? And they're going to be struggling to be in a 2,000 calorie surplus, right? So that, I think, is just important to understand. The cool part of that study, though, is they had 2 different weight gainer groups. One that was eating pure carbohydrate, just maltodextrin every day. The other group, 20%, 80% mixture of whey and maltodextrin. And the other group just said, hey, maintain your habitual diet and we'll train you. They gained, I want to say it was 1.5 kilograms, so less than half of what the other group gained of lean mass. But they also lost, I think, it might have been 1 kilo of fat mass. So they were actually in a net deficit, if you think about it, even though their body weight went up slightly, because they lost 1 kilo of fat and gained 1.5 kilos of lean mass. And again, you would need to put on 5 times the amount of muscle of the fat you lost to actually be in a surplus, if you think about the energy content of those tissues. So it constrained their growth, but I'm sure they weren't unhappy with what happened. Like, oh, I got a little bit leaner. I look more muscular. I don't look as good as that guy whose body fat didn't change and he is 7 pounds heavier. But hey, at least I'm 2 pounds heavier and I got leaner. Like, I'm not mad. But those people did actually have a worse body recomposition than the people who are in the 2 overfeeding groups because they were constrained, right? They could have grown at that rate, but there was not enough of an energy surplus to provide a consistent ability to do that. So their body basically was throttled by the constraint of not consuming enough. So the way to view that, when you then overlay it with studies on advanced lifters, like the one we did at AUT, we published a few years back, where we saw for most muscle groups, no evidence to support that being in a larger surplus enhanced the rate of growth or the growth experienced in the bicep, tricep, or quad on muscle thickness from an ultrasound, except for the bicep, which I'll get to in a second. And it didn't matter if they were in a 5% intended surplus or a 15% intended surplus or a 0%, aka maintenance. They all gained a similar amount on their quad and tricep. And the only thing that we saw was that the more weight someone gained, the more their skin fold changed. There was very strong evidence of that. So basically, the larger the surplus, the more fat mass gained. But we saw very weak evidence that the biceps might have grown more with the more weight someone gained. And the biceps had the highest volume closest to failure out of all the muscle groups that we measured in that study. So that's another piece of evidence that indirectly supports that study on the untrained people, that, hey, if you can accelerate the rate of growth to the point where it's measurable and you constrain it by not providing any type of surplus, maybe that would indicate that for some of those participants, and that's where maybe the signal to noise came up, that you're holding back the rate of growth. So I think the way I always put it is that your nutrition is permissive to hypertrophy. And that while we often say in the world of fat loss that you cannot out diet you can't out train a bad diet. Like you can't do enough cardio to offset the fact that you're eating cheeseburgers, right? It's also true if your principal goal is muscle growth and you're trying to be in a surplus. You're one of these people who's relatively small and wants to get bigger. You're skinny or you're whatever. That you can't out diet a bad training program, right? Like you can't force a surplus if there's not the stimulus to grow. If you eat a shit ton of protein, if you get yourself into a 500 calorie surplus and you're like meeting all the evidence-based guidelines for nutrition, but you don't train at all, or you only train once per week with a poor program, you're just going to put on body fat. And that's just the way it is, because the process of putting on muscle growth is very much akin to farming, right? So if you don't plant a seed, you can water it all you want, or gardening maybe. You can water it, you can get the perfect soil, you can get the sunlight right at the right place, and wherever you are, your perfect greenhouse, there is no seed for it to grow. No way to get around that. So if you can create an extremely efficient training program in a trained lifter, or if you can give a trained lifter anabolic steroids, or if you take an untrained lifter and you don't feed them a sufficient amount, now it's not that you need the surplus, but you would have benefited more from the surplus. And how big should that surplus be? Well, in a perfect world with a magic wand, we would know exactly at what rate of growth we can achieve, and then what would be an appropriate surplus. But the general recommendation that I give is to use kind of a backward calculation of looking at your average body weight change as a decent proxy for being in a surplus, knowing that it's not the true calculation of it. So I think a decent rate of growth for someone who is in the novice to intermediate stage is, say, 1% of your body weight gain per month. So you're looking at maybe 2-week rolling averages, and you just want to see it trending upward. And then for anyone more advanced than that, make sure that your training is progressive, hard, sufficient to put a stimulus into you. Get everything else right in terms of recovery. And then you probably want to see some indication of slow gain on the scale over a 1 to 2 month time frame. And I wouldn't even really want to give too much of a number to it, because you can certainly hover around maintenance so long as you're not super lean, maybe edging yourself towards a surplus, but you don't want to be in a deficit. And you should be seeing slight increments in progress in the weight room. And maybe you notice let's say every 6 months, you do a 1 month cut and you just kind of come back down. And eventually you'll notice, I look a little bit better at the same body weight, And like if you look at advanced natural bodybuilders, they often feel like they can gauge progress once they're like 10 weeks out from the next show. And they go, oh, you know what? I think I'm a little bit better at the same weight, or the same weight is a better body composition. But, if they don't have access to like high quality skin folds or circumferences, then it's very difficult to objectively, gauge this progress. But it's kind of like, you stick your fork in the brownies to make sure they're not soupy in the middle. You're baking. This is like, oh, am I occasionally seeing like my overall, my reps and my load are going up? Am I progressing in the context of the gym? And do I think things are looking a little better over time? And when I do a mini cut, am I better at the same body weight? That's kind of the approach that advanced lifters need to take, because it's going to happen slow enough, even in a best case scenario, that you probably don't want to be in a more purposeful, measurable surplus, unless you psychologically just can't handle the kind of the slow gaining thing, and you need to have those delineations. But then you just need to accept that you're probably going to have to cut down more often.
This has been a fantastic deconstruction of a lot of the absolute claims we see running around in the highly competitive hypertrophy branding space on social media. So you are one of the best. This is why I like coming back to you to talk about these things. So thank you. Everybody does need to follow you on Instagram at Helms3DMJ. So please go follow Eric. Thank you again, my friend. Is there anything else you want to point people to?
No, I greatly appreciate that. And I think people can opt in to the level of nerdiness they want with my content. Absolutely just follow me on social media to be honored. You can also check out our YouTube channel. at 3DMJ, Team 3DMJ. And if you're interested in getting coaching or guidance or consultation, I act as the chief science officer to the 3DMJ crew, who are some of the most experienced drug-free strength and physique coaches in the game, working with people at all levels, whether you're a world champion natural bodybuilder or just somebody who wants to put on a little muscle. And then if you want even more depth, then of course there is the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. The 3rd edition just came out in December of last year. So belated Christmas gift if you celebrate to yourself in your brain. But no, these are kind of like my collective thoughts on all things nutrition and training if you want to build strength or muscle. And then if you're like, hey, I don't just want the current, brain of Eric. I want the evolving brain of Eric as well as all of his colleagues. And I want to stay up with the latest research. Check out Mass Research Review, where we purposefully try to create a living understanding of all of the stuff as it comes out with our monthly subscriber-based platform, and we cover all the latest data on health, fitness, nutrition, as well as strength and hypertrophy training.
But the audio listeners, I'm holding up my copy of my 2nd edition Muscle and Strength Pyramids training. So
we got to sort you out, man. We got to get you the 3rd.
Look forward to it. Guys, thanks for tuning in. If you are interested in more of Eric, it wasn't that long ago that I had Eric on. I don't remember the number. I apologize. But if you scroll, you will find the episode. It's another deep dive. And thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate you guys. Thank you, Eric.
My pleasure.